Part of it is just because fear is just such a fundamental human thing, right? It's the result of evolution and biology. We need it to survive. It's incredibly important in that context, and I think also very primal.
What was your personal journey getting into this world of media? And what were maybe some of the fears that were present for you as you transitioned into it?
For me, how I learned about the world was through stories, right? Whether that's like books or movies. Like when Time Magazine or Newsweek came, read it, cover to cover within a day or two, right? So I was always very attracted to stories. I always naturally really enjoyed writing. I had, my first blog, in middle school. It got me into a little bit of trouble in high school, actually, but you know, uh, apparently teachers and principals only read the headline.
Alex started off his career in finance, but then transitioned to working in editorial for both one of the fastest growing media upstarts in the US, as well as one of the largest, prior to that. And so he has a wide variety of experience working in different editorial environments. Welcome, everyone, to Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. I'm Rahul Didwania, your host for today. And unfortunately, our normal co host, Gabe Crane, is sick today. And so it's just going to be me for today. But if you enjoy listening to us, please share us with a friend or leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And follow along our journey by joining our newsletter or following us on YouTube. And you can find links for all of that in the show description. Today's episode is called Fear and the Media. And we're joined by a dear friend of mine, Alec Liu, who's a writer and the current head of marketing and communications for a strategic venture and I'll introduce him later on. But this episode, Fear and the Media, is episode number 4 in our Fear miniseries, or a miniseries on facing fear. And if you haven't listened to some of the previous episodes, we encourage you to do so. Last week, we had a neuroscientist on to talk about the neuroscience of fear. The previous week, we had my former co-founder to talk about fear as it relates to being a founder and starting a company. And then we have our introductory episode, just laying out the premise of this series. And so bringing us to today, fear in the media. This one is, the way we look at this episode is it's a broadening or widening of the aperture with which we're looking at this topic of fear. So far, we've been talking a lot more about the personal experience of fear, what it feels like in our brains, in our bodies, psychologically. What is the lived experience of being fearful, and how do we start to come to terms with that and cope and coexist with that fear? And today, we're talking about fear in society, right? And using media as the sort of the channel or the medium through which to explore that question, because fear is, as we all know, ever present, right? And there's a persistent narrative around how present fear is in the media, and no matter how little or how much we consume media, we tend to get exposed to that fear, and it's not just something that we feel individually, but it becomes part of a collective experience of fear. And so today, that's really what we're going to be looking at, and looking at it in that broad sort of global sense, and then connecting it back to what does that mean for us individually, right? When we are within a system like that, what can we do? How can we relate to that dynamic? And so, without further ado, I want to welcome on a dear friend of mine, Alec Liu. Alex started off his career in finance, but then transitioned to working in editorial for both one of the fastest growing media upstarts in the US, as well as one of the largest, prior to that. And so he has a wide variety of experience working in different editorial environments. And so we felt he's very well positioned to talk about this topic, this topic of fear and how it shows up in the media. As I mentioned earlier, he's now the head of marketing and communications for a strategic venture fund. And Alec, welcome to the show.
Rahul, hello, thank you. It's an honor. It's a pleasure. But my hands are a little clammy right now. I think the predicament of being invited to a podcast with a theme of fear is that, d barring any scheduling conflicts, you can't really politely decline out of fear now, can you?
No, no. I mean, tell me a little bit more about it, Alec. What was it like for you when we talked about you joining this episode, and what are you feeling right now as we get into this?
Oh, I mean, now that we're in it's always better. I think that's how fear sort of always works. It's the buildup that kind of kills you.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, you texted me at like 10:30 on Tuesday or something, and I was getting ready for bed. I was like, I cannot process this right now. I will follow up in the morning. But yeah, I mean, I this is not something I ordinarily do, and I think with all new things, that fear and anxiety is going to exist, right? And so, yeah, I've been freaking out all day.
I love it. Well, we'll make that fear our companion through this conversation. And so, focusing still a little bit on your story and your journey, Alec. I know you didn't start off your career in editorial, right? And what was your personal journey getting into this world of media, and what were maybe some of the fears that were present for you as you transitioned into it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my sort of professional career uh, path has been kind of, let's just call it very unique and unexpected. Uh, that can be good or bad, but I sort of appreciate the journey that I've had. Um, I didn't grow up thinking, oh, I want to be a journalist or anything. I I grew up in a small town. We were immigrants, and I would at a time where the internet wasn't really that big of a thing. And so, for me, how I learned about the world was through stories, right? Whether that's like books or movies. Like when Time Magazine or Newsweek came, would read it, cover to cover within a day or two, right? So I was always very attracted to stories. I always naturally really enjoyed writing. I had, my first blog, in middle school. It got me into a little bit of trouble in high school, actually. But, you know, uh, apparently teachers and principals only read the headline as well. So
And I have to ask, Alec, was it a Zanga?
there was a Zanga, and then I built my own. I built my own website. I forget what the publishing platform at the time was. It's like Toronto or something. I guess it's like a predecessor to WordPress. Um, but it was really cool because the internet was sort of just coming up at the time, and the possibility of being able to have your own voice and your own platform, totally independent. That was a very new and exciting thing. But again, being a child of immigrants, well, I mean, technically, I'm an immigrant too. I was born in Shanghai. I came here when I was 2. Um, the thought of like going into writing or going, into media, it honestly just never even occurred to me. Right? I had great relationships with my English teachers. I enjoyed writing, but it was a hobby. I knew I wanted to go to New York. I knew I wanted to make money. And so, of course, I ended up in finance. I think, luckily for me, um, I graduated. Well, luckily, unluckily, I graduated in 2008. Um, Not a great time for Wall Street, let's put it that way. And so, my trading desk was selling a product called volatility swaps, and that was like the bread and butter of the desk, and that product sort of completely died with the crash. And so we were all kind of like sitting around, not doing too much in those couple of years. and I was able to use that time to write, and I created my own blog again. And then eventually, one of my friends was working on a project with this company called Vice. I'm sure people have heard of it at this point. It's shut down now, I guess. But at the time, it was just so exciting. It was like, wow, like here's a company that's edgy and cool. They're leveraging the internet in all the ways that I thought the internet could be leveraged, and they're telling a story um, from you know the the perception of my generation, and there was just this. It all just felt like very exciting and liberating, and I was like, oh man, I have to be a part of that. So I shot them an email and resume, and they offered me an unpaid internship, which I ended up taking. And so that's sort of how I ended up in the world of media.
Awesome. Thank you, Alec, for walking us through it. It sounds like there was this thread for you that dates back to your childhood that made its way through that entire story, and that's that's really cool to hear. And as you've now been in media for a really long time in different capacities, coming to our topic, right, fear in the media. Um, Starting just very broadly, like how would you characterize the relationship between the media as an institution, and fear?
It's a good question. Um, I I I think part of it is just because fear is just such a fundamental human thing, right? It's the result of evolution and biology. It's we need it to survive. It's incredibly important in that context, and I think also very primal, right? Um, and I think with that also comes with a bit of irrationality, and so the media's job is to get your attention, and so being able to leverage that side of our humanness turns out it's incredibly effective, right? So naturally they're going to use that, and yeah, it works.
Yeah, and so I mean, this idea, right, of fear being primal and it's part of our sort of inherent survival mechanisms, right? That's something we talked about a lot in some of our previous episodes. And I noticed when you said, "Hey, the media's job is to get our attention," that something just like I don't know what it was, but something just like popped up in me where I was like, I felt like an aversion to that characterization, not because I disagree with it, but because I think there's this idealism that surrounds the idea of what media could be or what it should be, as
Yeah,
like more a medium to inform, to educate, to entertain, but
right.
not necessarily to mix all of those all together and to muddle them, which I think is one of the criticisms, right, of media today. And while there's this acknowledgement, right, that hey, like tapping into something primordial is effective, that aversion that I felt, right, is this thing of like, oh no, but is there not like a higher calling? And that's just what came up for me, and I'm curious how you react to that, or if you relate to any of that feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally the concept of leveraging fear to sell a story isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It might even be a neutral thing. I,
Mm,
I I think there's a time and place. It depends on the story. Um, I mean, I remember when what was that Al Gore documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, right?
yeah,
Um, like that's I didn't know about global warming or climate change before that documentary. And I certainly did after I watched it, right? And I look, I'm not going to speak to accuracies and accuracies, whether or not you believe in it or not, right? But um, it was very effective in getting a very important story out, right? You fast forward 25 years now, and my dad drives an electric car, right? And so I think there is a time and a place to hit a home run.
I did not mean to do that. Well, all right, we got a new sound effect. I don't
You
even know
got a
how I did that.
soundboard, nice. Um, yeah, and even if you think about the title itself, it's quite understated, right? Actually, and I think you can all, it you can only be understated if you have a huge amount of confidence. I think in your story, or if you're just British. But yeah, so like fundamentally leveraging fear is not necessarily bad. It's actually very important. I mean, fear can drive a lot of constructive activities and constructive changes in people and society, right? I mean, I had a friend, well, I have a friend, he's a bit overweight. He went to the doctor, and the doctor sat him down, and he's like, listen, if you continue on like this, you're going to die, right? And that is a message premised on fear. But now my friend is on a diet. He's lost 40 pounds, right? So fear isn't necessarily bad. I think where things have gotten skewed is just the media is in this chaotic sort of period of transition right now. I mean, I'm a few years older than you, so like for me, I sort of grew up without the internet, and then I had the internet, and so I sort of saw like both worlds very intimately. And like growing up, the media had very little competition for your attention. The New York Times came every day. My mom would scour the classifieds, for opportunities. Um, and that was also a huge revenue driver for them, right? And so, when you don't have that type of competition, you're better positioned, to sort of foster your ideals that, like, let's say, journalistic ideals that you're driving towards. And I think what's tough these days is that the competition for attention is insane, right? And so not only is it insane, like the cycles by which people pay attention to a certain story are also hyper short. And so, you know trying to get trying to break through that system, the incentives are a bit, you know out of whack, right? And if you think about what the revenue sources are for a lot of these companies, it's advertising, it's corporate advertising. I mean, um, we saw Elon Musk sort of dealing with that with his takeover of Twitter, right? And I
Yeah.
remember he spoke very eloquently of advertisers trying to strong arm him, to sort of manage what's allowed or not allowed on the platform, right? And so all of that impacts independence and objectivity to a degree, right? And it's you know ultimately we're all sort of humans, right? And so more than the ideals itself, we're going to be driven by the systems of incentives. So
Yeah, a lot of rich points there, Alec, in what you said. And I want to start by what you said about fear not being bad, right? I think one of the ideas around fear is typically when we feel fear, there's also an aliveness that's around it, right? You mentioned your
yeah,
friend going to the doctor. The analogy that's always worked for me, right, is when you step up to a cliff and you feel viscerally the fear of death, right? Fear of falling off. What it's pointing you to is the aliveness or the how much you want to be alive, right?
yeah,
And similarly with something like the inconvenient truth, talking about climate change and the potential impact of that. Again, whether you believe it or not, right? The idea has potency because it points us to that. And so what I hear in that general theme, right, is fear can be harnessed for good. And I think, what I'm observing is the sort of presumption that I came into this conversation with, right? That, hey, the media uses fear for bad, right? And not to say that that's not true. I think but both things can be true. And what I like about what you're talking about is the media itself is operating from a place of fear because of the economics, because of changes, a transition period that we're still in. I think a lot of times we think we might be on the other side, but it's easy to forget. Like the internet's only been a big thing for 20 some years, maybe 25 years, call it 25 to 30 years. Like it's not that long. And I'm just, I think, digesting that point that, hey, the media itself is operating from a place of fear, and therefore the media is also vulnerable then to
Right.
outside influence, to outside forces. And so, what can we expect then of the media, given that that's what the dynamic is?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? In terms of legacy media, and a very relevant question in an election year. There's a lot of overlap there in terms of how media and politicians leverage fear. Um, you know, Most likely, in within a couple of election cycles, the media landscape is going to be completely transformed, right? The reality is, uh, it's hard to change people's behaviors, but behaviors are often, I would say, like generational, right? And so a lot of these legacy medias, they have sort of legacy consumers. A lot of these politicians, are getting to an age, right? And so we are going to see a new generation of media and political leaders, as well as consumers with very different behaviors. And you know, I think for media in general, that's a huge opportunity, right? Because you know, fear for humans, that it's a survival instinct, right? And for the media, it's as you mentioned, it's also a survival instinct right now. Um, the the issue with fear, right? It's kind of like if you sort of succumb to it, then it kind of owns you, right? But if you manage it, it can be actually very rewarding and constructive. And the same applies to the media, right? Like if you rely on sensationalizing things and instilling this sort of fear, without the story to back it up or without the payoff, that is going to long term undermine the trust, that the trust that your readers or consumers have in you over time, right? You can sort of only go back to that well so many times. Um, so, in a sense, it is kind of a short term play, right? A good example actually just happened with uh, the Euros are going on right now. Oh, sorry, actually, it's the Copa Americas started today, and that's sort of like the regional big soccer tournament for the Americas. And Ronaldinho, a Brazilian legend, everyone knows him, right? Right before the tournament, he came out and he was like, "Listen, I'm not going to watch this team. I'm not going to support them. They're just not, they're not good or whatever." And for a big legend to come out and say that, everyone was like, "What is going on? Like, how could he say these things? How could he not support his brothers, on the pitch, etc." Just a storm of media and controversy, right? A couple days later, turns out he was trolling. It was a marketing ad for deodorant, right? And so
Wow.
if you leverage that kind of like primal kind of reaction, um, for something so cheap, you are sort of undermining your own reputation, your own brand, right? And if we look at legacy media, that's sort of the thing that they're lacking the most at the moment.
Yeah. And I think just putting it all together, Alec, I mean, what you're saying is that these changes, in particular in the economic landscape, right, have really led to media taking on this fear response and to be tapping into this primordial um, fear and using that to get attention. I feel like what you're saying around like, hey, you lose long term trust by doing that over and over. It hasn't dissuaded people or people being media from still going that route. Um, Probably because they're still fearful. They're not able to get to the other side and harnessing fear for creativity and taking the survivalist energy and putting it towards innovation. Do you agree with that characterization first of all, and then like what do you how do you make sense of that?
No, I mean, I think it's totally correct. They've sort of been on this path. The problem is that when you leverage this kind of strategy, you have to keep like up leveling, right? Humans are super adaptable, and they build up a tolerance really quickly. Um, if you look at like pre-Trump, and then obviously Trump really sort of accelerated the breaking of the system. Everything is kind of polarized, and now we've gotten to this point where it's like you have, let's say, two sides, and for both sides everything is always existential, right?
Yeah.
And the problem with that is after a while people are just going to tune out. you know it's you can only cry wolf, or tell people the sky is falling so many times.
Yeah, and it's a good point, Alec, because I feel like I've already started to see that. If I just think about like my little world, my little universe, and anecdotally, when I think about the types of conversations that people have, the maybe even my own experience of it, right, is it is that I'm like, what is the use of getting caught in the vortex? And it feels that way, right? It's like, and I think within that, I think then sort of transitioning from like media being fearful and therefore harnessing fear to our experience on the other side, what I'm hearing is, yeah, for a while it works. We feel fearful. As a result of that, we give our attention to the place that's tapping into that fear. And then over time, we become numb to it, right? Or maybe we're seeking what I've noticed for myself is I've wanted instead to be seeking revitalization and rejuvenation, so maybe that's on the other side of feeling numb.
100%. I mean, I'll give you a good example. I mean, part of my job is to sort of keep up with what's going on. And at one point, I was subscribed to all the local the local outlets, right? Like New York Post, New York Daily News. Um,
Yeah.
I had to stop because bad things are happening all the time in New York, and I just it wasn't. What's the point for me to sort of see all of that? It's similar with the Citizen app. My sister had it. She's like, "Oh, you
Yeah.
should get the Citizen." I'm like, "Oh, I do not need to know all of this, right?" Um, and so a lot of it is on the responsibility of the consumer. Um, and our behaviors are evolving. I would say the flip side to all of this, right, because there is this sort of like negative tint, right, to this fear in the media, but on the flip side, as a consumer, you have never had more tools to get what you need, right? It might take a little bit of work. It might take some management on your end, and to sort of not fall to your basest instincts, but there's really good stuff out there, right? And it's better quality than ever before, but you do have to go out and find it. And it goes back to what I was saying about trust, right? Like, these days one of the ways that I get a lot of my information is from newsletters and YouTube, and that's already gone through like a layer of like filtration and curation from people that I trust, who people over time have shown that they are not just going to leverage cheap thrills to get me to open their email, that they are going to deliver me um, quality information, quality truths that are going to enhance my life and my knowledge, right? All of that is available out there. Of course, the problem is that there's more noise than ever before. And often what makes the headlines is all of the noisy kind of, you could say pointless stuff.
Yeah, this is actually a very eye-opening part of this conversation for me because I think I definitely have felt a doom narrative, emerge within myself that like, hey, this is just a downward spiral, right? And it
Oh, and, and,
never
and to
ends
be
until you hit the
fair,
ground.
the doom narrative is correct, right? Like, look around us. I mean, the world is definitely not as chill of a place as it was, like, let's say, a couple decades ago.
Well, but I think so. So for me, I think with the do narrative, right, is that it's this downward spiral that we're all going to be caught in this grip of fear until, we're no more, so to speak. And I think what we just talked about and what you just said, and why it's really sticking with me is actually there's a self-regulation mechanism,
Yeah,
right? That at some point the fear becomes too much. It leads us to maybe ask the question, like, which parts of this fear are serving us, which are not, right? And if
yeah,
we start to notice that, hey, like there's too much noise, it's making me fearful, and it's not serving a purpose, we actually start to correct, right? And that's what we do individually as a consumer, but also there are people who are still operating from a place of ideals, and and they're emerging economic models and business models to support those people. And increasingly, as people self-regulate towards those people, um, there's room for, dare I say, hope around this whole situation.
yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about two things right now, right? Like first, to your point, right? When it seems like everything's kind of crap, all of that means is that there's a huge opportunity for people to do things in a better way. Um, and you know, when things are going really well, that opportunity doesn't really exist, right? And so for me, it's actually a very exciting time. I would say, additionally, um, a big part of this problem is technological, right? And we're seeing it across across everything. It's like life didn't change very much, for most of people's lives, and then now all of a sudden things change so quickly. And so, as an individual, the vigilance, the management, the self-control, required to be on top of it. Yeah, it is a much bigger challenge, for sure, right? Back in the day, you could just read the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, you know, watch the evening news, and you're basically there. But yeah, no, these days, you have to take a lot more personal responsibility.
And so, just looking at that whole dynamic, right? What are like the tactics that the media uses to tap into this fear within people, both traditional media, but also contemporary and newer media, whether using technology or otherwise? What exactly is happening? What is the dynamic in your view, and what is it that makes it so complicated as a consumer to be able to withstand these tactics?
So I would say first and foremost, yeah, having worked, for a couple of media companies, it's not it's not like as malicious as people from the outside might think it is.
Mm,
You know, um, these people are really good at their job, right? Like, they know what works, and there are formulas that just really work, right? Um, I remember uh, the editor in chief, of, this was the really big media company. Like, it's like if something happens to a beautiful woman, like, let's say she's like attacked or like, that's gonna make that's gonna make the front page, because everyone is like a beautiful white, blonde woman, like, that's just gonna make the front page, right? Because at that time, like, that formula always worked. um and at both of these companies, when you're there, there's a big TV screen, uh and all it is just a chart of all the articles and how they're performing, you know? And so everyone's sitting there, like, trying to get on that TV and trying to, like, move up the rankings, Like, when I was at Vice, like, I remember when my first piece went viral, right? And you just see it, boom, it zooms up, and you're just like, "Oh my gosh, wow, this is amazing. This is so," like, every day you're going in, it's a weird thing, I would say, media, because a lot of places you go work and you're kind of like all on the same team. In media, you kind of are on the same team, but you're also competing with the person right next to you, and you're all competing like on that chart every single day. And everyone is like they're searching for stories, they're searching for angles, they're like honing in on the right headline that's going to hit really hard. And then in the next day, it's all gone. It's like a whole new set of headlines, right?
Yeah.
And so you're just like kind of like stuck in this game a little bit. And I would say in the beginning, oftentimes, I was looking for things that I thought were important or things that I personally found interesting, right? But once you get a taste of that, now I'm like, oh man, what's gonna hit? Ooh, I know my audience. Ooh, they're gonna love this, And then so it becomes a little bit corrupted because of your own ego
Mm.
and narcissism, and also just general human competitiveness, right? So
Yeah.
it's not. I wouldn't say that it's fundamentally malicious, but these incentive systems sort of create this, right? And I think you talked about how is like the media going to transform potentially into a better version of itself, right? Like a lot of the things that I follow these days are people that I follow, right? Like maybe they're on YouTube or maybe they're on Substack. Like they aren't playing that game in the same way
Right.
because they have their own captive audience, very similar to how the New York Times had a captive audience, right? But now rather than this whole organization, it can just be one person or a few people, and that's actually pretty exciting. There's a give and take, right? Because there are benefits to scale, certainly, and so you know we're going to have to figure out a way to sort of design these systems of incentives in these organizations such that we can deliver better truths, right?
Yeah, and what you were describing as your individual experience, right? Trying to get on that TV screen. It sounds like the individual experience is just a microcosm of what we were talking about earlier, right? What the media industry is facing as far
Yeah,
as a survivalist angst, as far as a um, competitiveness, right? To
yeah,
make something happen. So that makes sense. And I think what I heard in the tactics is it's just a lot of fine tuning, right? A lot of fine tuning and understanding what's going to hit, what's going to catch. And because of the incentives, um, that, we're kind of invariably the media is going to be taking the short term view, right? Because it's what is the hit of the day.
yeah. I mean, there is an art, and a science to writing a good headline. But like maybe if you're like a feature writer for like a cool magazine, like maybe for Michael Lewis, you just go talk to some cool people, hang out with them for a few months, and then you write like one article, right? But a lot of people in media, like they got to crank out stuff every day. I mean, I had a friend who worked at Business Insider who was like cranking out 6 things per day, which is just crazy to me. Um, and if you have to pump out stuff every day, uh, it's hard to maintain all of the ideals of ethical journalism all of the time, right? You're sort of just like in a factory grinding out words constantly. um and so it's easy to get lost in the sauce a little bit, for sure. There's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And so I really want to actually focus more of our time on the other side of the equation that you started to allude to, Alec, which is like, all right, we're on the receiving end of this. And on the one hand, there's everything we've been talking about. There's this whole system that's been corrupted by the economic realities and technology and competition, and they're incentivized to get the hit of the day, and that incentive means, among other things, they're going to tap into fear. And so on the one hand, we're just like pawns on the other side of this huge system. On the other hand, kind of what you were saying is like, hey, also we have actually more choice, more access, more um, resourcing than we've ever had as consumers. And so, how do we, on the receiving end, sort of transition from that version of reality? Because I think what I hear from a lot of people and what I see is this like critique of media and where it's gone, but also, to use that term from Heart of Darkness, right? There's this like fascination of the abomination where there's a critique, but you also still can't look away from it, right? And that's that like, one version of reality. How do we move away from that? How do we find our own agency within this dynamic?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I feel like our generation, let's say like the millennials and Gen Z, in a lot of ways, that's already happened. I mean, when I worked at the big media company, right there, there's they have the cable portion. I worked on the website. Um, and so you know, the cable portion of it, the demographics were already like very old. Like people in our generation that they don't watch cable news. Um, the website skewed a little bit younger, and interestingly enough, it also skewed a little less partisan. It was more towards the middle. Um, and you know, I think if you look at our generation, we are already sort of naturally adjusting our behavior, right? Like we selectively get our news from a ton of different sources. Maybe not Gen Z, they're all just on TikTok, but um like to me the process has already started. Like I don't feel like people are necessarily beholden to, like, let's say just the New York Times or just the Wall Street Journal. It's more so it's like when those outlets are producing really good work, it we will choose to consume it, right, opportunistically. um I would say, beyond that, uh people, there's a lot of discovery to be had, because I think there are a lot of people innovating in this space, with new business models. And there's a lot of, like, very good people out there creating really good content constantly, and I think a lot of us are just sort of organically finding those things, right, whether through YouTube, whether through our friends, etc. So I think the process sort of happens a bit on its own, and then obviously, if you want to take more ownership of it, you can go and try to seek out the best sources that you can.
Yeah, I'm just noodling on what you're saying because I guess I'm
And I
less.
and I would also add, like we don't need to consume media all the time, right? Like there is not that much important stuff going on every single day, every single week, actually. And so that's actually a key point as well, I would say.
Yeah, that actually ties to what I was going to say, which is I don't know that I feel like our generation has been cracking the code on this. Like I do feel like we get news and headlines from more sources than one, but they tend to also kind of converge along a common theme. We hear all the time about echo chambers. You're talking about YouTube. I mean, YouTube's algorithm generally pushes things that are similar and they're going to keep you there versus trying to give a kind of a broad view. And so for me, and again, just thinking about my own friends, like I feel like we're still in the fear whirlpool, right? And if anything, I mean, like if I look at my friend group, it generally leans politically left, right? And it's like, okay, on the left, there's a huge harnessing of fear around what it would look like, for example, for Trump to win again, right? And what does that mean for the state of the country? And we don't need to get into a political discussion here, but more so just like I see that our group, for all the sources, all the access that we have, we're also subject to fear mongering, and we're also subject to this collective experience of fear around the state of the world. When I always feel like that's heightened, that's not reflective of the totality of experience, but it's what's presented, it's what we see now, not just from one place but from many places because of the way that these systems are working.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think everything that you said is totally true, right? With social media, like with TikTok, with the echo chambers. Certainly. Um, I guess one thing I would say is that I feel like we're a little bit past maybe the worst of it. Let's say when like only certain views are allowed, or you're gonna get canceled for this or that. I, for one, I feel like things are starting to open up a little bit again, and I think that's also. I mean, again, like Elon with Twitter is kind of a good example, right? Like Twitter sort of leaned like one way, and now Elon wants to take it the other way. I think that's what's beautiful about having an open society, is that the pendulum will swing the other way as well. Um, I my parents grew up under the Mao era, and so a lot of these things are relative. And I think when we're sort of in the storm itself, it just feels like, man, everything is so bad, everything's going towards this bad place. Um, but with an open society, a lot of these things can be self-correcting, as well. I This is not about like the religion or anything, but I read RZA's uh autobiography, from the Wu-Tang Clan, many years ago. Um, but he talked about uh this sect of Islam called the 5% Nation. Um, and I always found this framework very interesting because it can apply to sort of a lot of things. But the general concept is that you know, sort of 85% of people are kind of like blind, or they're just going to sort of follow the flow of the algorithms or the echo chamber, right? Let's say 15% of people have like crawled themselves into enlightenment, right? Um, 10% of those people, let's call them the evil media, right? They might leverage their enlightenment to take advantage of those 85% of people for their own personal gain, for their own vanity, for their own need for power, whatever, right? And then there's the 5%, right? The 5% nation. Um, they are going to use their sort of enlightenment for the betterment of people, and the world, right? And look, the numbers or the breakdowns, might not be accurate or whatever, but I think that general concept sort of exists in reality, right, as a truth. And so, yeah, it's always going to feel like maybe the majority of people, like, or society is just going to this bad place or whatever. But the opportunity to I think find enlightenment and to take control, and to transcend the algorithms, the power for the individual has actually never been greater, right? And I think with how the ratios break down, right, sometimes it feels like you're alone, or sometimes it feels like like no one really gets it, and or whatever. But it's the opportunity is there, right, for everyone.
I love that you shared that because that's really, really resonating with me, and I think there are two nuggets that I'm pulling out here. One is that, hey, we're in a period of change, and there are self-correcting mechanisms in society, and I think that's something to really, it can be hard, I think, to connect with that idea and to feel optimistic, to your point, right? When we're in the eye of the storm and maybe we feel like we're in the 85%, maybe we're only hearing from the 10% and we're getting blinded by that and we're getting afraid ourselves. And what I hear in your message is like, no, like there are a lot of other things happening, that are positive, and that we can hang our hat on. And then the second piece is really around, I kind of take what you said almost to be like a call to action, right? Which is like, how do we make our way into the 5%, right? If we're not there, and what level of personal responsibility can we take? And I think tactically, you mentioned earlier this idea of like, hey, we don't need to be engaging with media all the time. Yes, there it's addictive. Yes, it's been designed to kind of draw us in and prey on our fears and all that. But are we going to sit here and say that we don't have the ability to step away from that? I don't know that anyone would say that they can't, right? Like they would want to believe at minimum that they can. And so this idea of like finding our own separation, connecting with our own truth, um, connecting with the larger truth, right? The word enlightenment, and finding people who want to be a part of that positive movement and that positive contribution, I think is a really powerful call to action. And when I think about my own strategies around this stuff, uh, I've generally taken the approach of like minimizing my media consumption because of the effect I know it can have on me and because of the effect I've seen it have on people in my community and in my world. And then trying really to focus on like, where can I have a positive contribution, right? I mean, even this podcast is in that spirit, right? Is like, hey, hopefully these conversations are a part of people seeking their own, creating their own inquiry, finding their own truth, and seeking their own version of enlightenment. And yeah, I'm just sitting with this formula, and I'm curious what that brings up for you.
Call to action 100%. Um in the context of, ultimately the media landscape is going to be a reflection of us, right? They exist in a complementary way to us. And so, you can complain about the media, be like, oh, the media needs to change. Um, but this is like with all things that are going to bring fulfillment and change to your life. Like, first, you got to focus on yourself, right? You got to focus on your own behaviors. Um, and like one way to think about it is consuming media is a skill that you develop. It's a knowledge base that you develop, and it's something that you're going to get better at over time. It is something you have to work on, right? Like you can't just sort of be like a blind consumer and just expect society to only give you the best stuff, right? It's the same with like nutrition. It's eating healthy, eating smart is hard. It takes work. It takes a lot of knowledge. It takes a lot of tools. It takes a lot of habits. It's the same with media, and that's something we all need to work on and develop.
Yeah, that's such a great analogy. I think I'm just thinking about the whole debate that happened around like banning sugary drinks or banning soda and how it became such a like hot button issue. And it was interesting. Like I found myself at different times on both sides of that debate, of like, hey, like, yeah, like we've kind of studied and clearly been able to prove, quote unquote, prove that these sugary drinks, these sodas are not good for you. And so as a society, should we not work towards eliminating those things and removing temptation and setting people up for success because environment matters as much as it does. But then ultimately, I think where I landed was on the other side of the debate, more along the lines, I think, of what you just said, right? Which is, well, okay, those things can be there. There's always going to be vice. There's always going to be temptation. There's always going to be something in our environment that takes us out of our idyllic vision of who we want to be or what we think good is. And so, really, the onus is on us to find a way to cultivate that identity, to act and operate from that identity, and to be the people we want to be in spite of what the landscape is. And then to kind of layer in what you were saying, then as a result, the landscape will change, right? Now we have more healthy drinks in the marketplace because that became a thing, that people were valuing and caring for. And there's that synergy, right? That you're talking about that shows up in nutrition as well.
Yeah, like the amount of nutritional options that are available out there now, the amount of information for nutrition and health that's out there now, is unprecedented, right? And at the same time, that the temptation's still going to be there. The top down approach, you know, it's very difficult. Um, it's very difficult for it to be effective long term as well. Like look at the war on drugs, for instance. Um, and actually, like a good example is recent, right? So they were worried about like teen smoking because of Juul. So right, so they banned Juul and banned all of the flavored pods or whatever. Um, and so what happened was, instead of having this regulated American company um, provide a nicotine product for adults, what we had was a flood of unregulated Chinese products with ingredients that who knows what's in there, flood the market. And all that did was shift the market share from Juul to all of this black market Chinese product.
Mm.
And now, like a week or so ago, right, like they unbanned Juul already because they're like, well, it didn't work. Now the kids are puffing Chinese vapes instead, right? Which is worse.
Wow. I did not hear about that chapter in this in that story. I know the Jewel Band was a huge deal,
And
and
at the time, we understood it, right? Like, if you're trying to advertise to kids or whatever, it's like I think people were generally okay with it. But again, the top down approach often has these unintended consequences.
and in your view, like, is there a place for that? Is there a place for somewhat of a values-driven top-down approach? And
100%, 100%. But the implementation has to be very simple and smart, right? As an example, like you shouldn't be able to say like super hateful, racist type stuff, right? On a platform. Like there should be consequences for that. Um, but then like where sort of do you draw the line, right? Because then if you start employing this web of rules that starts to look like, like the tax rules of America, you know then we start to have issues, right? And so like you need some like baseline values to adhere to, and you need common sense around those baseline values. um you just don't want the bureaucracy of those values to get too large, because that's when things start to get muddled, and that's when maybe like corporate interests start to take over, and then you get again unintended consequences, right? Like censorship of very 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 bad things, right? Let's say like terrorists trying to recruit terrorists, very bad, obviously censor. But for the most part, we have to allow sort of society to figure out their own things.
yeah, I'm like curious to explore this, but I feel like it'll go off into a
Yeah, I mean, this whole
tangent.
moderation,
And
censorship, like I'm not anti-moderation or anything, but as a thought exercise, like it's not an easy problem to solve. And I will say, like over time, a lot of these things can be sort of self-correcting.
yeah, and I think if there's anything to take away from this conversation, right, it's something around that idea that, hey, like we're in a process. When we're in it
Yeah.
and we're in a correction process in particular, it's hard to see it. And the best thing that we can do individually, um, is to find our own enlightenment, right, within
Yeah.
whatever the context is, and take ownership over, our role in it, our reaction to it, the way we want to show up.
And
Yeah.
if I may instill a little fear in your viewers, because things are happening at a rapid clip, and it's only getting more and more rapid, right? Like now we're adding AI and everything to the equation. So, the time to start getting on top of these things is now, right? Because it's only going to get crazier and crazier.
Well played. Well played. I can feel my own fear when you say that. I'm like, oh my god, you're saying that, for as fast as the rate of change has been, that it's only going to be faster. And that's scary.
Yeah, and it's also going to get easier to just rely on the algorithms, and to rely on these little sort of companions that you know because why not? It's so easy, it's so convenient. and over time that's going to sort of mitigate your personal autonomy, right? And so if you don't start fighting for that now, in your own sort of personal life and in your habits and how you think about things and how you gain knowledge and truths, it's to pick those skills up in 10 years is going to be much harder.
And so if we were just to go one layer deeper on what you just said there, Alec, like if you were advising somebody on how to build those skill sets, what sorts of habits to try to cultivate, what are some of the specific actions that people can take or the questions that they can ask themselves to kind of get going in that process?
Well, I would say the easiest way to do it is to start finding people that you trust, and um don't give that trust easily. Like, that trust has to be developed over time as well, right? Just like any of your relationships. um I think that's step one, right? um I think step two is sort of what the whole purpose of education in college was always for, which is like start practicing your ability to have independent thought, and critical thinking, because I think these days it's so easy to take positions based on maybe what's trendy or what's going to give you some social benefits, or maybe you heard someone say something smart and so now you can repeat that and feel smart, right? Practicing having that sort of independent thought, I think, is super valuable. And what I would say is that you start to realize how easily it is to see like who is actually an independent thinker out there, and sort of who is just kind of repeating kind of what they heard, or what they think they should believe, right?
Mm.
And because that's going to be the ultimate armor against all of this stuff. And, as you practice that, you're able to, rather than feel outrage when you see like a nasty headline, you're able to see the truth behind it actually without sort of succumbing to the negative effects of it, right? You're like, okay, so I know, where that writer is coming from. I see what they're doing. And I see what the actual information is, right? Without getting, oh, I can't believe he did that. Oh, how could he? My day is ruined.
I really love that. And I think that call to cultivate our own independent thinking is such a strong one. One of the things that I'm reminded of right now is forget who said this, but some podcast I was listening to, where someone was like, hey, you only have, let's just say, like 300 books you're going to read for the rest of your life. Instead of reading like a new book every week or whatever, what if you took the like most timeless books and that have timeless wisdom, and started to build a relationship with that, right? And pair that with something like, oh, read like history instead of reading current events. Read uh, a New York or an Economist article rather than the Twitter headline, right? This idea of like where it pairs with what you're saying, right? Like build foundational knowledge and exposure, and then from that place, make your own independent assessments. Um, Look at things, from a principled standpoint rather than from a reactive standpoint.
That's actually a great point. Like there is no better filter than the test of time, when it comes to truths and knowledge. And I think as part of a generation where everything's about sort of what's new and about progress and everything, I think it's sort of easy to forget that. So yeah, I agree with that 100%. The reality is that, amazingly, humans figured most of this stuff out a long time ago, and like cyclically we will sort of forget and rediscover these things, but I feel like a lot of these fundamental truths haven't really changed too much.
Yeah, I'm a big believer of that, and I think we do innovate, in our understanding of those truths and applying them to differing realities, especially as our realities, external realities change. Um, But I think a lot of the core truths in terms of what really matters, what's foundational, what's timeless, uh, it's just that it's timeless, it persists. And that's no different today than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, or what will be presumably 50 years from now, 100 years
Yeah.
from now, or 200 years from now.
Yeah, and but I think that also speaks, in terms of the media opportunity, right? In terms of maybe remixing sort of some of those truths rather than, like, let's say, trying to take down sort of old ideas, like remixing them for like a new generation, understanding your audience and understanding how they can sort of consume those truths for themselves, right?
Yeah, love that. Well, Alec, as we approach time here, I just want to say this has been super, super rich. I know I'm feeling a different optimism, a different relationship, to to this topic, to the narrative even around media and the way media harnesses fear and how we're all stuck in this loop and blah blah blah. And it's kind of like where we ended in terms of the message is actually what we always try to come back to on the show, right? Is that hey, you have agency. What you do matters, and it influences not just your own life, but the life of people around you, right? Because there's a generative component, right, to taking a particular position on all this stuff. Um, and so, with that, I just want to punt it over to you one more time, Alec, to see if you had any final thoughts or takeaways that you wanted to leave our listeners with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just building on your sentiment, right? I think there's a ton of doom and gloom out there. There's a ton of negativity out there, but I would say on both sides, if you're on the creator side, if you're on the consumer side, there's the fact that there's all this chaos just is validation that there's a huge opportunity. And Yeah, I think to your point, it's on us to take it. Um, and Yeah, it's an exciting journey.
Yeah. Well, Alec, thank you so much again for your time for this conversation, and to you, our listeners. If you're taking this in, if you've made it this far, think about your own relationship to this topic. How do you relate to fear? How do you relate to fear in the media? What is your individual experience? What is the experience of your friends, of your families? What part of it is similar? What part of it is collective? Really encourage you to reflect on that and see, where have you become part of the 85%, right? The 85% that's, in the herd, that's following kind of what's been laid out for them, slave to the algorithm, so to speak. And where's there opportunity for you to find your own version of enlightenment, right? And harness that for the betterment of ourselves, for the betterment of people around you, for the betterment of the world. And so, with that, I want to thank you for tuning in and listening to us as always. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, leave us a review, all that good stuff, and we'll be back and looking forward to being with you again. Until next time.